Have you ever wondered why some people are so good at hiding the truth? Think Bernie Madoff. Whether it's during a business negotiation, in politics, or through the manipulative tactics of news outlets and social media, it can feel like we are constantly being let down by those we thought we could rely on. And if you're a professional who depends on knowing if someone is deceptive or telling the truth, it can be even more challenging. But as a matter of fact, deception detection is an essential skill that can help us navigate the complex world we live in. The problem is that deception itself is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, which can make it incredibly difficult to detect. And there are several reasons for this problem. First, lying is an intricate process that involves multiple cognitive and emotional factors, and there's just no way to identify the signs of deception accurately via nonverbal communication signals. No matter what you've heard or read, Pinocchio's nose does not exist. There are no reliable nonverbal deception cues that occur only when someone is lying and never when the same person is speaking the truth. Empirical science tells us it's just not there. Second, some people are just naturally better at deception than others, which means that these people are pretty good when it comes to hiding the truth. Because that's what a behavior analyst does, looking for the truth that's leaking through, not the deception. Third, cultural and social norms can influence how people communicate and interpret information, which makes it difficult to distinguish between truthful and deceptive behaviors. Fourth, individuals who are motivated to deceive can take countermeasures to avoid detection, such as rehearsing their lies or adapting their body language and facial expressions to make them look more believable. How important it is to look believable, what significant impact it has on someone being believed, this is being discussed in the interview. And finally, people can engage in different types of deception, such as lying by omission. They can use partially truthful or even completely truthful statements to omit critical information, which is way more challenging to detect than outright lies. All of these factors contribute to the complexity and difficulty of deception detection, making it a tough skill to master. But don't worry, there are ways to improve in the arts of deception detection, at least to some degree. In this video, we will delve into the science behind why, and more importantly, how people engage in deceptive behavior, and we will provide you with practical tips to identify and interpret scientifically validated deception cues. These cues are probably not what you expect, and they may go against what you have heard or read in a myriad of TV shows, workshops, and nonverbal communication books. But if you stick with us, by the end of this interview, you will have a deep understanding of how to recognize and respond to various deceptive acts in real-life situations. We will also show you exactly where and what to look for. Whether you're a law enforcement officer, a business leader, a salesperson, or just someone who wants to improve their interpersonal skills, this video is for you. It's a special addition to my presentation at the recent Behavior Analysis Congress in Prague, and it's designed to give you the tools and techniques you need to master the challenges of deception detection. We won't be relying on non-verifiable claims by so-called lie detection experts. We'll be sticking to empirical science. In this interview, I'm speaking with Tim Levine and Steve McCornack, two academics who have spent their lives researching deception. Each of them has prominent deception theories to their name, deception theories that have stood the test of time and which were at the core of my own academic research. Together we will provide you with the knowledge you need to take your deception detection skills to the next level. Are you ready? Good, I think here we go. Tim Levine and Stephen McCornack, thank you for having me back. It's my pleasure. I thought about how to best introduce yourself in a nutshell. Yeah, so I hope you forgive me. In my mind, and that's just came to me. In my mind, for me, you're the yin and yang of deception research.
Wait, who's yin and who's yang here?
Why? Because Steve, you focused on deception production with your research, information manipulation theory, and Tim spent the last 30 odd years researching deception detection. So for me, that's just yin and yang. I cannot describe it any better. Okay. So very briefly, maybe who wants to start? Who wants to start first? A very brief introduction from each of you.
Tim, lead us off, man.
Sure. My name's Tim Levine. I'm Distinguished Professor and Chair of Communication Studies at UAB, which is University of Alabama at Birmingham. I am the author of Duped, Truth to Fault Theory, and the Social Science of Lying and Deception. Thanks to seeing the book, I now can read my own title. And I've I've been doing deception research for just a few years less than Steve. I got started as a graduate assistant in Professor McCornack's lab, and have been doing deception research ever since, chasing down
So
truth
this is a
lies.
classic instance of the student far exceeding the master. My name's Steve McCornack. I'm a professor here at UAB and the principal author of information manipulation theory, as well as subsequent works, IMT2, etc. I've been studying deception since the mid-1980s. Started out in detection work, and Tim was a graduate assistant of mine at the time who gave me extraordinary, really expanded my capacities in an extraordinary fashion through his statistical and methodological expertise. Even as a grad student, vastly exceeded my own at the time. And together we worked for a number of years on unraveling different issues related to detection. And then in the later 1990s, after a series of very public battles and arguments with other scholars in the field, Tim really doubled down and expanded work in detection. I actually left the deception field for about a decade, and then came back and was focally interested, have been for the last 10 years, in production issues. I was originally in the early 90s, got interested in production stuff as well, but then left the field for a decade and then came back.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, I think you offered us just a perfect segue to jump into our session, right? So at the beginning, I wanted to discuss, how shall I say this best? There are a lot of stereotypical deception cues who have manifested themselves or rooted themselves in society around the globe. Yeah, there are different reasons. I would like to discuss it in a moment, but Steve, you just mentioned it that you left deception research for about a decade. Yeah. I don't know if you want to elaborate just a little bit to explain what really happened there, because it's related to this whole money generation engine that evolves deception detection. So maybe you start with that one.
Sure. It's and I think I can condense it to a reasonable fashion, a reasonable length. In the early 1990s, late 80s, really, and early 1990s, a position began to be advanced within our field that was very specific related to detection. Namely, the argument was that the relationship between so-called liars and detectors was typically a highly strategic one, in which liars were consciously aware of everything they do and strategically manipulated the behavior so as to look truthful. Meanwhile, detectors, as it were ever vigilant in scrutinizing every behavior and trying to catch people. It was a paradigm that had almost no representation in actual reality, but it was very appealing, especially because it pushed the idea, which was central to our interest, which was that liars emit very consistent cues across time, people, and situations that would be detectable. Tim and I, in sitting through a number of these papers, began to realize two things. One, there was an agenda here, namely government funding to the tune of millions and millions of grant dollars that people were pursuing. So this was not an objective scientific quest solely. There was a financial incentive. Second, that their data simply didn't support. None of their data supported the arguments at all. Deceivers in these experiments were emitting random cues, not any that could be considered strategically adaptive or anything. So long story short, we started writing papers and doing studies that criticized this position. Well, at the time, the people advancing this position held posts of power in the field, notably on editorial boards, and our research was stonewalled again and again and again across various journals. And so the condensed version is that I got tired of this and decided I'm done, I'm out of here, and wrote a swan song piece, my goodbye to the field of deception, which is the '97 piece on deception theory that was published in John Green's book on message production. Tim, being Tim, if I may be so bold as to speak for this person who's been a great friend of mine and colleague for 30 years plus now, doubled down, because Tim is anything if perseverant and resilient, and he's like, no, I'm not letting this one go. And so he went to war, and as a result of Tim's efforts, really changed the trajectory of much of the field, certainly not all, but many of the recent trends in work are a direct result of these 1990 battles and Tim's decision to go to war on these issues, and has really pushed the trajectory of paradigms in a very different direction.
I think it's a nice example. Sorry, before we come to you, Tim, yeah? I think that's a nice example of, I heard someone saying, progress in academia comes one funeral at a time, right? Okay.
He published and perished all the same, was a cartoon I saw years ago.
Yeah. Now coming to Tim.
Even though following up on. Just following up on Steve. Even though progress has been made, this isn't over. If you read a lot of stuff these days in psychology, particularly done in Europe, still the presumption is that liars are exceptionally strategic and possess this huge meta-communicative awareness. So a lot of the theorists, what they do is sit down and think, if I was like this super spy, what would I be doing, and project this onto liars' behavior.
Before we come into the details, Tim, I have the paper in front of me, Scientific Evidence and Q Theories in Deception Research. Yeah, and when I read it the first time, I think I read it 6 or 7 times. So when I read it the first time a couple of months ago, I don't know the exact English word to use. It's probably flabbergasted. Yeah, especially about your. The first 2 paragraphs where you were quite explicit. And my invitation to you right now would be to explain what you described in those first 2 paragraphs in terms of this whole financial interest that's in the industry, both on those practitioners, but also in academia, like Steve already hinted to.
I'm not sure I can remember the first 2 paragraphs of the paper. But there definitely is a huge market to sell the public, government, business, whoever, simple little secrets to lie
detect. Law enforcement and intelligence.
If only you do. Law enforcement is huge. But businesses want this. Insurance firms want this. Everybody would love to. Anybody who's ever been on a dating app would love to know the little secrets, surefire secrets to detect lies. And from a military perspective, what they would really like is be able to get some private to do this with minimal training, where it just kind of pops up truth lie. And so if you promise that, so we're going to do this grant work that's going to uncover these secrets. Yes. Governments just throw money at us.
Absolutely. And what's more is the process. The process. There's very little competent oversight. So in our previous discussion, Thomas, I noted this instance where I got this call out of the blue in my office, and from this governmental agency, and they wanted me to do a 24-hour turnaround on this proposal, and this was immediately post 9/11. And so they sent this out to me, express, and got the proposal. I immediately recognized it as Paul Ekman's, using Paul Ekman's detection model of, microfacial expressions, everything. And they wanted to throw $20 million at this institute to do this. And so I wrote this long review drawing upon Tim's work and some of my own, detailing why this is just not scientifically valid. And then subsequently the next morning, we had this conversation with the whole committee in which I told them this in no uncertain terms. They'd basically be throwing money down a rat hole if they did this. And their answer was, okay. And then they funded it anyways. Why? Because this goes back to what I wrote in 1997, which is there are these hopeful myths, and they have historical context. This goes back thousands of years to Aristotle. That one of the most fundamental human desires is to know when other people are lying, and if people have this idea in their head with all of that motivational power behind it, that they can detect or should be able to, it's very difficult to dissuade people from that and get them to stop clinging to that.
Very briefly, in regards to government funds for academic research, I probably, together with many other people, made the error in thinking to believe that, let's say, Secret Service, police force, and so on, they have accumulated their own experience and knowledge, and they give this knowledge from generation to generation. Actually, and that was for me new when I started to dive into this field, is they buy this type of information, right? Yeah. And as a real coincidence, I had 2 days ago, I had a little exchange on my LinkedIn account where Wiklander Zulawski, right? Published an article stating they want to get rid of pseudoscience in courtrooms. And I said, well, that's an interesting comment for a company who peddled the Reed interrogation methodology for decades. Then somebody defended them and said, well, but they changed now. And my argument was, that may be so. The company may have changed. But as a result, we still have like tens of thousands of law enforcement officers out there on the street applying this methodology today. So much for getting rid of pseudoscience out of courtrooms, right? Again, money, what you said already. This is being sold, and nobody really verifies what's being sold. Yeah. Okay. Because we're talking already in regards to law enforcement and deception detection, what can either of you tell us?
This is Tim's domain, so I'll chime in, but I'll let him take the lead. Go for it. Because Tim's worked with law enforcement all over the world, really, and a lot of regional and at the federal level.
I can tell you that my experiences in training efforts to train law enforcement is almost a perfect linear function of what I might call the level of them. I've had great difficulty with patrol officers, sergeants, detectives at the state, county, local level. They absolutely believe in cues and are completely resistant to any academic suggesting that anything that they know to be true might not be the case. On the other hand, when I've talked to prosecutors, particularly at the county or state level, experienced prosecutors, what I tend to say jives with their experiences throughout their career. When I've talked to FBI profilers, they're very open to it. When I've talked to kind of elite intelligence officials, they're much more open and receptive, and same with elite customs agents. So it seems like the more real experience they've had and the more educational background they had, the more open and the more their experience seems to match my take on that.
Well, there's a context to, there's within the United States, of course, there's a lot of kind of levels of suspicion culturally and subculturally about academics versus law enforcement kind of thing. And quite honestly, it's also exacerbated from the behavior of many academics who go into law enforcement settings with a very condescending attitude and, oh, you just don't understand, and try and tell them what they know to be true from their day-to-day experiences, or say that isn't valid. So there's complication there in terms of the broader context. But my limited experience compared to Tim's, supports exactly what he said as well. I remember, for example, when he and I worked with the NSA interrogation team, these folks were very open to everything we said and pretty much agreed with everything that we were doing and talking about, which is why they chose to work with us.
Yeah. So.
Yes.
And they performed really well.
It's on my list. The NSA is on my list. Yeah. So. The research that I read, there are quite a number of papers out there who basically say that law enforcement in general, there are exceptions like the NSA, and I would like then you to explain why that is. Law enforcement in general is exactly like the general public on the 55% margin. And I also want to discuss the 54%. There's also something to be said about that. Yeah. So basically, it's the same as you pick any student from a campus, compare their performance with the performance of the general law enforcement, and they're basically at the same level, right? Now, I think, I'm not sure anymore who said it to me, Tim or Steve, yeah? The one exception that either or both of you found were NSA, and how did they do that? What technique did they apply, or what were they looking for that made them better than the rest?
They listen. They focus on content. And Tim will elaborate on this because he knows way more about this than I do. But the role that behavior plays with them is indirectly diagnostic. So they look for demeanor shifts in reactance to questions that are asked, but they're not going to heuristically jump to therefore lying. They're just like, oh, there's some reactance there. I'm going to find that out, what underlies that. So we're asking a bunch of really good questions, and they're listening super carefully. So it's right out of Tim's domain. I'm using this as a segue to Tim. It's content in context.
Okay, Tim.
But there's more to it than that. Because if we put those same NSA people in the same experiments that generate 55%, they do 55% too. So if we just show them videotapes of, in like any other deception experiment, when Nora Dunbar and team uses the same group of people, but they write the questions and make them follow the questions, they get 58% accuracy. So it's only when they get kind of free reign to ask what they want to ask, go what they want to go, follow up as they see fit, and where they know something about the context to make listening actually work in their favor, that they do remarkably better.
Okay, and now we said it already a couple of times, the 54%. Who would like to elaborate on the 54%?
I will. So there have been hundreds and hundreds of studies where people are exposed to some number of communications, half of which are truth, half of which are lie. And then they are asked, is this true or is this a lie? And it's scored just like a true-false test. And when you do a study like that, you get 54% plus or minus kind of a random 10%. It's very normally distributed around 54% with the standard deviation of 6%. Anything much above or below 10% discrepant from that only happens when it's an exceptionally small study. Any study with a reasonably large size, the findings get closer and closer to 54%. It doesn't matter what media it is. It doesn't matter if you're showing people LinkedIn pages or they're interacting face-to-face or you can just hear audio. It doesn't matter if it's face-to-face interaction or videotaped. It doesn't matter whether it's students or law enforcement doing the judging. It doesn't matter if it's lying about important things or trivial things. It doesn't matter if it's lying about facts or emotions. You always get this 54%, which is statistically significant, better than chance, but on the face, really, really poor. And the findings always find that.
Okay, and if you now split deception detection from truth deception, what results do you get?
So deception detection is defined as distinguishing between truths and lies. So that's an average across the two. So it's always in comparison. So truth detection is always in comparison to lie detection based. But if you just score how many they get right on truths compared to how many they get right on lies, the accuracy is always higher for truths than lies because, as a term Steve coined, is truth bias. People guess true more often than lie, hence they're right on truths more often than lies. And this is incredibly robust.
Okay, so I saw a paper. I thought from one of you that I think deception detection accuracy, when you split it out, is in the lower 20%, but truth detection is in the lower 80% range.
That would be extreme. More typically would be like a 40-60 split. I have found splits that big, but more typically it would be 40-60.
Yeah, it's further down my list here, but since you mentioned it already, truth bias. Yeah, so there is an interesting one. You just said Steve coined the phrase, but you came up with truth default theory. Yeah, so how did this?
What happened was Mac Parks, professor at University of Washington, who's my mentor, and I were working on a study all the way back, ancient history in 1984, 1983, 1984, and we were trying to model how close couples, how the closeness, how the intimacy might impact their ability to tell if their partner's lying to them. And one of the things that we read was I believe it was Zuckerman, DePaulo, and Rosenthal, which is a 1981 meta-analysis. And there was a footnote in that piece that just buried, like on, halfway through, this little note that says, there may be this tendency on the part of some individuals to presume that others are always telling the truth, a bias toward making truth judgments. And we saw that and we're like, I bet you that plays a big role with intimate couples. And then, and so, and the study went on and became known eventually, as the McCornack-Parks model, so-called. But that one term, Mac and I literally were just sitting in his office going, what are we going to call this thing? And we're like, we'll call it truth bias, So we come up with this term, and then it becomes, decades later, one of the most studied concepts in the field. And it all goes back to me and Mac just sitting in his office chatting and going, what do we call this thing that Zuckerman, noticed? And then when Tim started doing, and I'm not going to speak for you, Tim, but you could take over the story. But when he started doing his work with me, one of the first things we did was replicate that model and documented the effects of truth bias. And then at that point, Tim just ran with it. And go ahead, Tim, you can take over the story from there.
So truth bias in the original meaning and thinking about it was something that happens as you get closer relationally to people. But as research progressed, it became apparent that it wasn't unique to people who know each other. Everybody's kind of almost always truth biased in studies. There's some studies where it doesn't happen, but it shows up in like 80% of studies. And when it does happen, it can sometimes be slight or it can sometimes be extreme. But findings definitely tilt towards honesty. But what occurred to me, and maybe the main insight, one of the main insights of truth default theory, is calling it truth bias might be really misleading. It is absolutely truth bias in a lab context where half of communication is deception. But it's absolutely not a bias at all in people's everyday lives where communication is predominantly basically honest. So it's not subjects that are truth biased. It's researchers that are biased by putting people in a communication situation that is where lies happen way, way, way more often than they would in any experience ever in their life. And in the lab, being truth biased lowers your accuracy for lies. In real life, where most communication is honest, truth bias makes you right more of the time purely by chance.
Well, and it's also important to note that this has a cognitive basis. Cognitive researchers have documented there is this kind of truth default in terms of our fundamental perceptual processing, and so Tim's absolutely correct in saying to call this a bias is kind of like calling breathing a bias toward inhaling oxygen, or whatever. It's kind of like this is kind of the way our brains operate with evolutionary adaptive purpose behind that. And so it is really a fundamental truth default. It's a much more precise way to characterize it.
Yeah, but it has a very practical implication, right? Most people think the better you know somebody, the better you can identify if this person is lying to you or not, right?
This is true, but it's more complicated, okay? So the better you know somebody, the more intimate you are with somebody, the more you think you can tell. And the more you think you can tell, the more you're also inclined to think that they would never lie to you. And those forces drive your accuracy down. So is love blind? Yeah, but kind of indirectly, and it's also comparative to normal truth default blindness, which makes us all kind of susceptible to duplicity.
Yeah. One last thing, maybe. You said it already. Truth default or truth bias, which you don't like to call bias, is adaptive. Yeah, there was an evolutionary reason to have this, I call it mental program in our minds, because it served us well, right? Now, Tim, you said to me, you don't like to call it bias, or you don't really see it as a bias. That I tried to figure this out in the preparation for this interview. I'm not there yet, because there are a number of cognitive biases, right? And in our email conversation I wrote to you, is it not just another cognitive bias, and could we then not test it via an implicit association test? And you said, no, it's not a real bias. So enlighten me.
I'm not sure I am familiar enough with implicit association test to really have a deep conversation on this.
Okay, but you said it's not a real bias.
Yeah, no, I don't think of it as a bias. If anything, in deception detection experiments, when people are prompted, right, then this brings it to mind, and they guess true more often than lie, which I argue is closer to the communication environment. But if I didn't ask you, if I didn't bring it to mind, in truth default theory, it wouldn't ever come to mind implicitly or explicitly. So the idea in the truth default is this just doesn't occur to us, even at an unconscious level. So I don't think this would. I don't buy the kind of unconscious lie detection thing. I think there's just nothing going on related to veracity unless it's being artificially induced by some researcher asking you, do you think this is truthful or not? Or unless there's something in the situation that triggers you.
Thomas, so you think about, like, how do we think of bias? So here's empirical reality, and there is an empirical reality regardless of what we think. And then here's my perception. If I perceive bias, and how I would define it as a systematic tendency to basically perceptually go in a different direction other than what is empirically the case. But if I say, oh, I have a bias toward believing in gravity, so I'm biased toward thinking that this object is going to drop, and I drop it, and then it drops. Is that a bias? No, it's the way we perceive things, and it matches empirical reality. And Tim's point, I think, is that when you have a field in which, and by this I mean an observational field, in which the vast bulk of communication is truthful, and then we perceive it that way, is it fair to say that that's a bias? not really, you know.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, analogy, it never occurs to me subconsciously or consciously that my computer monitor is going to start floating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? I accept gravity is there, right? And I would have to like be in a spaceship or something to start occurring to me implicitly or explicitly that maybe gravity isn't relevant anymore.
Yeah. Look, I'm questioning this, and I want to pull this a bit more into practicality. Yeah? And I believe I have mentioned this in one of your interviews that we had before, right? I had a profound experience myself showing me how strong my own truth bias actually is. Yeah. I told this. We were sitting on a long table. There were like 15 managers that told a story so incredible. I don't even dare to repeat it here. And I believed it way too long. Yeah. And again, the moment I realized what's happening, I had truth default in my mind immediately. Yeah. But it showed me to what extent the situation actually has to go before you get this kind of consciousness in your mind that says, hey, wait a second. Yeah. So again, I know from my own experience, this is not just a theoretical concept. This is an extremely strong program in our mind that we already have a very long time with us, right? Because it's beneficial. Okay, so that's why I'm again, I don't want to make this too theoretical, but from my own experience, I know this is a very powerful
it's really important.
construct in our mind.
It's in our survival interest when we have incoming sensory information from ears, eyes, nose, tongue, body, that we don't stop and ponder the veracity of that. You know, as Tim joked in a documentary we did a number of years ago now, you know, you go back tens of thousands of years. If I see a shadowy movement of my peripheral vision and I go, I wonder if that's a giant predator coming to eat me, I'll ponder this for a while. I'm going to get eaten. But if I just presume that's an actual object and flee, then I live to reproduce another day. And so it has an evolutionary purpose. But I think it's important for listeners or consumers of this information to know that our default brain, perceptual brain setting is to represent information as valid. And so if you push that further then, under what circumstances are we not? Well, even if we're suspicious, even if we become suspicious, the default setting will be representing information in memory as valid. And then what we do is compare that against other associated information. And then if there's a disjuncture there, it gets spit back to conscious mind at that point as being, wait, that's suspicious after all. So if there's no information that's dissonant at all with information we already stored in memory, you're not going to have any suspicion arise at all. And importantly, even if information has come in advance that you would suspect would make somebody suspicious, the degree to which that's actually going to change your associated networks that when you get the information leading you to see disjuncture is limited. Because there are all kinds of perceptual errors people make with regard to incoming information, right? They may not believe the person who tells them that their partner's lying to them or whatever, right? There may be motivational impulses. I don't want to believe that my partner's lying to me about this. So, yeah, it's surprisingly, in simple terms, it's surprisingly difficult to make people suspicious.
Okay, good. I would like to kind of close the discussion about nonverbal communication and body language with this research that from Albert Mehrabian, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, that 93% of our communication is nonverbal. So 55% is body language, 38% is tonation of voice, and only 70% is verbal, right? Now those were only two studies done, I believe, in the early 1960s. And this statement, this 55-38-7 formula, you can find against 1 million times on the internet. Yeah. Now, Albert Mehrabian is still alive. I have reached out to him for an interview, so far unsuccessful. However, he has a website where he actually tries to rectify this kind of complete out of proportion misconception of his original research. right? So coming back, because we just talked about evolution, yeah? So coming back to body language and non-verbal communication, we already established it's not suitable for deception detection, yeah? But that doesn't mean it does not have value in other areas. So my question to you is, in which other areas would you give, or would you credit non-verbal communication as adding value?
Yeah.
Conveying emotions, for sure. So a big way we convey emotions is non-verbally, especially the face, but not just the face. We use non-verbal things to regulate speech. So we've been having a little difficulty in turn taking during this interview that largely relies, and it would be more difficult, virtually than in person, because it's harder to gauge eye contact and things like that. We convey interest. We convey how much we like people. We convey status non-verbally as well.
One of the most important. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
But most time, I was just going to say, most of the time, nonverbal and the verbal stream work hand in hand. It's in Duped, I talk about demeanor, and demeanor's both. And you don't get good demeanor only from words, but you don't get all of demeanor just non-verbally.
You're not off the hook that easy. So the topic of demeanor is a highly interesting one, yeah. Because first of all, myself, when we talked about the first time, I understood something differently when you said demeanor, and I could imagine many other people think too, right? So first of all, we know that there's a physiology involved also. Yeah, we know that politicians with a certain jawline, are elected, have more chance to be elected. Goes back to evolutionary biology, etc., etc. But maybe you briefly explain what you really mean with demeanor and why it is so important if we believe somebody or not.
So demeanor is simply how people come off. So there can be a lot of different demeanors. You can have a I'm smart professor demeanor. You can have an I'm an honest person demeanor. And it's the whole package, so all the verbal content and all the verbal cues and all the nonverbal cues, all in combination. And I think one of my biggest but underappreciated contributions to deception research is deception research always focuses on cues, yes, as if they happen in isolation, that people are paying attention to gaze differently than they are speech rate, and that's different than how long they're taking to answer questions, and that's different than how many pauses they have. But that's not how people give off these things, and that's not how people are perceived. So demeanor is the whole package. And when you look at people with kind of one demeanor and another demeanor, and you compare them, there's huge differences between the two. And it might very well be the case that there's effects there's jawline effects in politicians. But those effects tend to be like really small. When you have a very large sample size, they're statistically not zero. But demeanor, when you see it, you can't miss it. You don't need large sample sizes to see it. It makes like a 50-60% difference in how accurate people are about one person compared to another. And this is another important point about 54%. That's averaging across people. This is not at all true for individual senders. There's some people always believe, and hence always get wrong when they're lying. And there's other people who come off really sketchy, and people tend not to believe because they're horribly demeaned, and people are wrong about them when they're honest.
So what you're saying is...
Let me just jump back. No, go ahead. Finish this, because I want to go back to the issue of nonverbal stuff for a moment. But go ahead and finish this first.
Hold the thought, because, Tim, there are people, and I have it actually here. I will blend it in when I edit this whole thing. Yeah, it's a very good argument. So you have people, they look honest, and you have people who look deceptive, no matter if they're really honest or if they're really deceptive, and that has a huge influence on deception detection accuracy. So please explain.
So in that chart you just showed, I argue that there are two kinds of people. And let me put in a caveat. I'm not sure if there are two kinds of people or there are two kinds of presentations. Because what I haven't done is I don't know that people who are demeaned one way in one time are necessarily always demeaned that way. Although I think there's probably some stable aspect to it. I don't know how stable it is. But if you do these things associated with honest demeanor, you have basically the honest demeaned people are the friendly, confident extroverts. If you come off as a friendly, confident extrovert, people are going to believe you independently of whether you're lying or telling the truth. If you happen to be an honest, friendly, confident extrovert, then you are matched. If you are on the spectrum and you're a little off or awkward in your communication, or you have very high social anxiety and you are honest, then you are mismatched. And people are more likely to doubt you when in fact you're honest. So if you would do an experiment showing only friendly, confident extroverts who are lying, and only socially awkward and socially anxious people who are telling the truth, you would find accuracy considerably below 50%. On the other hand, if you flip those around, you can get accuracy, 70, 80, 90%. And it's pure function of who you're seeing and how their demeanors match up to their actual honesty. And one of the arguments I make in Duped is that outside the lab, there's relatively equally numbers of matched and mismatched people. Or at least whenever you do kind of random assignment in experiments and you randomly assign senders to conditions, as long as you have enough senders, you will average out to 54%. But there's going to be very specific sender-to-sender errors in individuals. And this is why small studies that only involve a couple senders sometimes find accuracy very different than 54%. But as you start adding more and more senders to it, it gets closer and closer to 54%.
And that's another argument against the Q theory, right? Because a Q theory would say, independent of demeanor, a Q is a Q, right?
Yes.
So they are completely negating the importance of demeanor in their research.
So Q theories get it wrong in two ways. First, they get it wrong about the diagnosticity of Qs. Because part of my argument is demeanor is unrelated to honesty or veracity. The second way they get it wrong is to focus on Qs rather than demeanor. Because what people are doing and what people are judging isn't isolated behaviors. That's not how communication works.
Okay. So, Steve, you wanted, I don't know if you still have the thought in your mind.
Oh, yeah, no, this takes us back, but I think it's important to note is that, because the question on the floor a few minutes ago was, the relationship between nonverbals and what would be a diagnostic of or whatever. If you ask me to identify the number one most important aspect of nonverbal communication, I would say empathy. Because the human brain is hardwired, the part of our brains that process empathy is hardwired to the same part of the brain that processes visual feedback. So during communication encounters, I draw upon all the cues, as Tim was talking about, emotional cues and everything to read, but that enables me to be able to empathize with you. And when you take that away, one of the things you see with military veterans coming back from forward-facing combat theaters and they have TBIs, they take away their empathy part of the brain is damaged. They can't read people's facial expressions or process eye gaze anymore in a way that allows them to experience empathy. It also has grave implications, and this is really why I wanted to call it to the forefront for just a moment. It related to text-based communication. So often people are like, why are people so hateful online when they're on Twitter or whatever? Well, there's a neurological reason for that, which is quite literally, if I can't see you, it's difficult for me to empathize with you. And so the classic, thing of looking at a text message and going, "Oh yeah, well you wouldn't say that to my face," is actually really true. People probably wouldn't say that to your face if they could see you. And so and a lot of it is eye gaze. Establishing mutual gaze with somebody and then seeing facial expressions create a sense of emotional connection that fuels neurological development in infancy and also underlies our experience of empathy.
It occurs to me that this might be Trump's superpower because he doesn't have empathy. This allows him to flame people in person, and that other people find it just impossible to be that mean to somebody else to their face because they have like some minimal empathy.
This is quite valid. I mean, I think in addition to just matters of decorum and stuff, the capacity to, on a debate stage, just insult somebody without any emotional empathy for that human being standing next to you does give you, in the vicious world of politics, a competitive edge, which is frightening to consider.
And if you relate empathy now to deception detection, I mean, I know that building trust is key also in relation to deception detection. I had Lena Sisko here. She's a naval intelligence officer. She was in Guantanamo. Same thing. Robin Dreek, former head of the FBI's counterintelligence program. Same thing. Building trust. So building trust, empathy. If from your perspective, empathy in relation to deception detection.
Well, I think the very tools that we look to establish a bond, and again, it goes back to neurological development in infants, shared gaze with a caregiver helps to hardwire the brain in ways that allow this ability to perspective take and empathize, actually may very well lead us astray. I think it's one, I don't know if anybody's written this, and Tim may know somebody, but I think there is a pretty, arguably a strong connection between the global and historical emphasis placed upon eye contact as a means for detecting deception. Liars can't look you in the eye and lie, and the one of the principal nonverbal means through which we create both intimacy and empathy, namely shared gaze. So that is, if I see you looking in my eyes, and we share this gaze, I feel like I'm inside your head. We're as close can be. And if you're deceiving me, then the shared gaze is as terrible diagnostic value. And yet, time and time again, as Tim's research and others has demonstrated, that's the number one cue that everybody buys into. Tim, you want to go further with that? Because that's your stuff.
Because cues and demeanors aren't diagnostic, my empathy isn't going to help me much in distinguishing truths from lies. But it's probably going to make me more likely to believe you.
Yes.
However, in interactive circumstances, to the extent that I can convey empathy to you and you believe that I am empathic, then you're more likely to trust me. And this will give me power to get you to tell me the truth. So in truth to fault theory and in our studies with the NSA, one of the things they were really good at is they were very good at getting people who were cheating and lying about it to be honest. So empathy, particularly coming off as empathic, is incredibly powerful in interrogation as a way of establishing rapport, and rapport in turn to prompting honesty.
Well, and this Thomas, this tears the veil off of one of the most common myths within this whole industry and the entire field, which is the top people, the top deception detectors, quote unquote, and I say air quotes, in the world don't typically detect deception. What they do is get people to share the truth. And so they work their way to getting people to tell them the truth. So like in our NSA studies, these guys didn't use diagnostic cues and then say, therefore they're lying or telling the truth. 9 times out of 10, they got the people to tell the truth and confess who had cheated in the study. And so there's a and yet those two become conflated, right? That's then credited to deception detection when in fact they didn't go, ooh, they're looking down and to the left, therefore they're lying. Oh, you're right. That isn't what happened. Instead they're very, very good at cornering the people into confessing. And
let me further add that the point in outside the lab is almost never deception detection. The point is always what you want to know is what the truth is. So if I know you're lying, that doesn't really tell me much except I shouldn't trust you.
Exactly.
Right? But the reason we're asking is we want to know what really happened. Right? And deception detection, just merely knowing that somebody's lying about it, is not very informative.
But all of this, Thomas, underlies why we're doing what we're doing and why you're so interested and why globally it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is people really, really, really want to know what's in other people's heads. It's the foundation. That perception, that belief is the foundation for intimacy and trust and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what is deception at its essence? It represents a barricade that I've built between what you know and what I know. And that drives people nuts.
Information manipulation theory. So maybe that's a good segue to flip over from. I mean, we have established, again, nonverbal communication is ill-suited, to say it politely, when it comes to deception detection. However, there are definite benefits, again, in my perspective, especially if you look at body language through the lens of evolutionary psychology. One last example, maybe we all can detect fear in somebody as far as 100 meters away, and we don't even have to see the face of the person. Why? In evolutionary times, when something was dangerous for the person 100 meters away from me, it may have been exactly as dangerous to me. And for me, my ability to read those cues correctly might have saved my life, right? So there's absolute reason for that. So we are not discarding nonverbal communication in general, only very specific in the context of deception detection. Now, when we switch over to your both subject matter area, which is the information manipulation theory. Maybe we start with that one because we just brought it up. And truth default theory in relation to this specific deception detection, right? So if you start with information manipulation theory, 1 and 2, maybe you start first to explain the difference between 1 and 2, because there were how many years in between? 15, 20?
92 versus 2014, so... What is
maybe
that? 14 plus 8, 22.
Maybe very briefly, both information manipulation theory and truth default have been created by you gentlemen in your early stages of your careers, and they have stood the test of time. Not only that, they have fundamentally influenced, I think is the best word, deception research ever since. I have lost count how many times both as information manipulation theory and truth default theory is referenced. Hundreds, maybe thousands of times. I do not know. Yeah. Again, fundamental theories you both have created, have influenced deception research, and will continue to do so because both theories are still standing strong. They have not been falsified, I think is the right word, right?
Well, so as an interesting side note, and then we can dig into this, the TDT and IMT2, which is the most recent iteration, were developed completely independently. Tim and I, we hung out and did other things, shared beers here and there and stuff and socialized, but we actually weren't talking scholarship between us at the time that both these theories were in development, and yet they're like two sides of the same coin that came out. So it's just kind of interesting that people see them as complementary because even though we know each other really well day to day, we didn't talk about this stuff at all as we both developed these. But go back to IMT. In a really simple overview, IMT argues the original argues that people make very powerful presumptions during conversational interaction about what's being said, and in particular along multiple dimensions of information. And this allows us to have rational interactions with one another. Specifically, I presume that you're going to quote Grice, philosopher of language, make your conversational contribution such as is required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you're engaged. That's what he calls the cooperative principle. So if you bust that out, I'm presuming, as we're chatting even today and now, that everything you're saying is meant to be a rational part of this conversation. And what Grice was interested is in how people can convey non-literal meanings. And the reason is, if you say something that doesn't sound like it's a rational contribution, I'll actually presume that you intended this as a part of the interaction, but you're using it to mean something else. And so I'll do this inferential search. What could you be saying with that? And this includes things like sarcasm. Why would you be saying something false to me about your belief? And I'll be, oh, you actually mean the opposite kind of thing. When Grice got into what does it mean, make your conversational contribution such as is required, he said there are four things that underlie this cooperative principle. Quantity, you're going to share with me as much information as is irrelevant. Quality, you're not going to say false stuff. Manner, you're going to make it clear and direct. And relation, which is you're going to say things that are relevant to what we've just been talking about. Well, this opens the door, as I argue in the original piece, for then how people can deceptively play with information or manipulate information. Because you're presuming that my conversational turns will be rational, that is, I'll be telling you what I should be telling you and won't be saying false stuff. That opens the door for me to be able to covertly violate those. And because you're going to presume that I'm telling you everything I should be telling you, you're misled. Or because you presume that I'm not saying false stuff, you'll be misled. So what IMT gives us, the original gives us, is this pretty straightforward, simple model for the multiple ways that people can play with information when they want to mislead people. It's important to recognize that this theory was not really a deductive theory. I didn't, sit in my office and dream this up as a grad student. Instead, I gathered a bunch of data which, instead of telling people to tell the truth or lie, which is the standard experimental paradigm, I basically put them in problematic situations and said, what would you say? And I had prior data that suggested these are the kind of situations people might, quote, lie in. And I was presuming at the time that what would happen as a result is people would either tell the truth or lie, this binary which dominates our field. And instead, what I got as a result was anything but. I saw very few truths and very few lies, and instead, probably 90% of the messages were combinations of false and truthful information in incredibly sophisticated ways. Mm. And that led me to say what people are really doing in response to problematic situations, they're playing with information in ways, in creative ways. The IMT2, that's basically IMT in a nutshell. But it wasn't really a theory. I called it a theory actually because a student of mine asked me one day, "Is this your theory?" And I'm like, "I don't know." She said, "Well, you don't know if it's a theory?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll call it a theory." And that's pretty much like what everybody does in our field, And any kind of descriptive framework, people just go, "It's a theory." But it always gnawed at me as the years went by that it wasn't falsifiable. To go back to your issue of falsifiable, it didn't have testable premises. And so when I decided finally to come back into the field after a decade hiatus, it was my first mission to make a testable, what I would consider true theory of deceptive discourse production that's rooted in, and this is really an important aspect, what we know about speech production and language. So get out of communication and instead go to speech production and linguistics and neurolinguistics, and what can we say about how language is actually produced. And so IMT2 is a very specific propositional theory that draws upon that literature in looking at deceptive discourse production.
Okay, so what's the key? What's the key for deceptive discourse production?
I think the single biggest insight would be that, and I'm going to preface this by saying, I got laughed at just this past November for saying this at our national conference in a panel in which it was a top paper panel in cognition, and I said what I'm about to tell you, and people laughed, and it became a punchline. But nevertheless, with that as a preface, people simply don't, in conversational interaction, people simply don't speak in, quote, messages. And the idea of a unitary message, I think, has led us astray now for decades in deception. So when you look at the production side, how the human brain constructs discourse, what we do as we speak, we stream information from memory, and we build utterances as we go. I'm doing this right now. I don't know where I'm going to be 10 seconds from now in the future, right? I'm building this discourse stream as I go. The moment you call what I've done after I've done it a message, that reifies that as a unit that I created in my brain in a prefatory way before I spoke it. And then you think about, go back to how our field conceives of discourse. And I mean by the field of deception research. They're truths and they're lies. They're constructed as such in the brain and then spoken. And the truths are 100% truthful and the lies are 100% false. And the entire Q literature and detection literature, other than Tim's work and just a handful of other people, is rooted in that presumption. So that all of the stuff about arousal and Q leakage and everything is rooted in this idea that people in their minds construct these discrete unitary lies that create huge arousal and take huge cognitive load to construct, and then they spit them out, and then they're detectable as a result of it, right? This is not how people create discourse. All you have to do is read the speech production literature. And if people did that, what they'd see is, and then if they look at what people actually say, when instead of asking them pointed questions like, did you kill your wife, right? Instead say, so, tell me what you did last night. And what you did last night was go to a party and have fun with friends and had a few beers and everything, but you also stole this guy's wallet, right? What people will do when they speak is basically stream units of information, piece by piece, construct a discourse stream. And if that's the question, what did you do last night? And what they did was steal a wallet. They're going to talk all about the party and everything they did and just leave the wallet part out. So it's 100% truthful information disclosure, but it's a fundamentally deceptive message.
Okay, so my own statement is people do not have full control over what they're saying. They only think they do. Would that something that you concur with?
Yes and no. How's that for fence sitting? It depends on what you mean by control. So yes, they don't have full control if, according to IMT2, what our brains are hardwired to do, based upon, it goes back to George Zipf's principle of least effort in the mid 20th century. This argument that all biological entities are basically programmed to pursue the path of most efficiency, right? Principle of least effort. I think our brains are hardwired when it comes to discourse production to say what's easiest and say what's most efficient. What's going to solve the problem quickest? So if I judge, given situational parameters, that that this immediate dilemma is most easily going to be solved by popping in a piece of false information, I will do that. So is that out of my control? Well, I think our brains plot solutions in ways that are pre-conscious. So that's the yes. That's the yes. The no is I don't perceive I think there are executive processes that commonly play a role depending on context. As I go, so it may very well be the case that I may be mid-utterance, and suddenly I realize in what I'm saying that might lead you to inferentially go in a particular direction I want you to go. And so I, at that point, become mindful and change the direction of my utterance. If you're sitting thinking, well, what is this guy talking about? Let me give you a concrete example to illustrate this real quick. We did a study, and this was actually from IMT, in which this person had been cheating on their partner and having sex with somebody else, and the partner asked them if there's something wrong. And so they, and one of the things that predated the decision to cheat was they wanted to date other people. So they're telling the partner, yes, there is something wrong. Recently, my feelings have changed and everything. And, I think we should date other people. But as they're saying, I think we should date other people, they inferentially realize that might trigger the partner in the next turn to say, wait a minute, are you already dating somebody else? Which would put them in a forced choice lie true situation because they are having sex with somebody else. So they say, I think we should talk about seeing other people. And then they immediately follow that. But don't think I would ever do something like that without telling you, because I wouldn't. It's just my feelings have begun to change. So if you look at that so-called message and what they've done, they're streaming this information and saying everything that's wrong. And then they get to, and that's kind of automatic in a sense. It's just streaming long-term memory, right? What relevant information. But as this is coming out their mouth, I think we should talk about seeing other people. They're also in, oh shit, they might come back and go, wait, are you already dating somebody? They're like, I got to forestall that. I don't want to get into that. So, don't think I would do anything. And then that's a false unit. So at a broader level, what do you do with that so-called message? Do you call it a truth? Do you call it a lie? Do you call it a 7/8 truth? A 1/8 lie? And this is what we see in actual discourse. And our research recently has been unitizing these discourse streams into information bits. And now we're mapping the ebb and flow of these information bits to see whether it's outright false or spun or whatever. And the intricacy with which people stream information is just unbelievable.
Let me try it one more time. Yeah. So first of all, my own academic research showed that first of all, people don't like to lie outright. Right? That's true for negotiators, managers, whatever, even the people on the street. Second thing, and you mentioned it already, the dichotomy between truth and lies does not exist. Instead, it's closely intermingled. Again, a counter argument for the Q theories, yes. Right? They are so close connected, deception and truth, that it's very hard to split out, right? Now, when I said full control, yeah. What I'm seeing is that people they have an intent to voice a certain message, an idea of a message, but they have no full control over the lexical, grammatical way how they produce it, because exactly like you said already, this is not let's say a ready-baked cake that you shuffle out of the oven door, right? It comes as you speak. And that's what I mean with full control, down to the level of the function words, pronouns, articles, etc., which I'm sure you know, these kind of words are very hard to control. They're very, even if I'm speaking and I would try to control it, it would take so much effort for me, cognitive effort. I would not be able to speak. If you as an investigator would want to analyze my function words, you would no longer be able to understand what I'm saying, because it takes on your end also so much cognitive effort, yeah. So that's what I mean with full control.
True. Okay, so that's true. But let me challenge one aspect of what you just said, which is I think exceptionally important. Your description of that, the only thing I would actually quibble with is, and I know you're talking about a bit, so I know you didn't mean it in the way that it was voiced, but it's just important is to say I have an intention. Well, that really is the heart of it, because the way our field conceives of intention is as a discrete, singular mental state that exists before message production. And that feeds everything into cues and detection and everything. So how does the whole production process begin? By me deciding I'm going to lie. And that triggers everything. Arousal, blah, 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 that becomes, right? But if you buy into what IMT2 says, and that's a huge if, because most people, I guess, don't. We're basically throwing that out, because in two ways, as my colleague Dr. Kelly Morrison says, why singular intent? There are a multiplicity of intentions that are going to rise and decay during discourse production, and one of the things that IMT2 points out is where exactly in the discourse production process should that deceptive intent arise. It certainly need not be a priori, right? So go back to the example of telling the partner about the problematic information. I start out, they've asked me what is wrong. Yes, there is something wrong. Recently, been putting a lot of pressure on me to commit. We've been fighting all the time. Now, as I'm streaming that information, I might have no intent whatsoever to mislead you. It isn't until I get to I want to date other people that suddenly I realize, oh, you might go in places I don't want to. And so for that moment, deceptive intent arises and exists when I say that one piece of information. Don't think I'd ever do anything like that without telling you, because I wouldn't. And then it decays again. So when you look at the map of intention onto discourse stream production, what you can say with certainty is two things. One, there are going to be a multiplicity of intentions present, some of which are deceptive, some aren't, and all kinds of combinations and motivational impulses. Second, those intentional streams may arise, exist, and decay at any point in the speech production process, but certainly needn't exist beforehand. And when you see that, then you begin to realize, how can we build any models of detection that are rooted in intention triggering cues, or even verbal cues, right? Because there's a whole literature, if you talk to the linguistic side, that presumes liars are going to say, do these particular word pronominal forms or whatever. But if my deceptive intent exists for 1.3 seconds in the middle of a 17-second discourse stream, how is that going to impact any pronominal usage that's going to be discernible?
Before we go to truth default, right? If we simplify this a little bit in a criminal context, someone has committed a crime, is being caught, so we can assume two things. First of all, let's just say you're caught and you don't want to get busted for the rest of your life. So the likelihood that your intent is to deceive is relatively high. Yeah. Now I give you that absolutely. What I said already. You will probably stick to the truth as much as possible. Only on critical parts you either lie or you avoid the information, right? But there is some overall principle intent, so to speak, okay? But then, of course, it's coming from the streaming. It comes from the conversation and those split-second decisions in your mind for specific items, right? Yep. So again, I would quibble, to use your word, I would quibble with that just to figure out more detail. In that context, so how would you describe that, where you have an overall intent to basically not go to jail for 20 years? And then you have to build it into your discourse production.
Sure.
So do you believe there are any cues or not? Linguistic cues, huh? Yeah.
No. Yeah. No, I just don't. Not that are going to hold up across time, people, and situations.
That's true.
But here's the caveat. Do I believe you can construct experimental paradigms that might result in cues that hold up across time, people, and situations? I think you could, right? So I've got no problem with arguing that that if I force people into yes/no type answers or one utterance answers or whatever, and I have it, these kind of forced choice truth-lie scenarios, what card am I holding up kind of stuff, that you might, given the reasons you said, be able to see some consistent linguistic cues that are beyond people's control. Do I want to say absolutely that's not possible? No, I can't say that. Unfortunately, I think the direction a lot of people are going in with that line of work is into looking at brain stuff. And I just challenge people to ponder the generalizability of studies that have people slid into an fMRI and push buttons with their fingers, which requires a different part of the brain than speech production. Digital response behavior in response to instructions, push this button or that button. Do we want to say that that's lying or telling the truth? And there are hundreds of studies that look at deception production using fMRIs, in which what they're basically doing is have people push buttons with their fingers based upon instructions. And they're saying, see, liar's part of the brain lights up. That's a liar? So, anyways.
Okay,
yeah.
So I would like to switch to Tim and truth default, and I would like to use the segue. I would like to use Grice, his 4 maxims of.
Before we get there, could I add 2 things to IMT?
Of course.
First, one of the things that, this is just a little rant, but I think it's relevant. One of the things that drives me nuts in current deception detection research is the vague recognition, a la IMT, that messages aren't either all false or all true. The solution is almost always, well then, what we shouldn't have people do is make truth-lie judgments. What we should do is we should scale honesty on a scale of 1 to 7 or 1 to 10. Because messages can vary but this completely misses the point that what makes a message deceptive or not, no matter how we define that, is not in how much true or false information is in it. I can be deceptive with all true information if I know you're going to misinterpret it. So that just absolutely drives me nuts. The second point I was going to make is from a detection point of view, I find IMT incredibly useful. And maybe one of the biggest occupational hazards I've had as a deception researcher who was involved in some IMT studies very early in my career is now I hear when people leave out critical details. And I hear when people are being unclear. And I hear when they're changing the subject. And I don't infer that they're being deceptive. But I notice that they're doing these things. And I wonder, are they just scatterbrained? Right? Or do they really want to talk about this thing? Or are they steering me away from something? Or, oh, there's multiple ways that could be interpreted. What do they really mean here? Or, ooh, they left this detail out. Do I want to ask a follow-up question or not? I think those, if I were, an interrogator or somebody who, really needed to detect lies detect deception, I would cue into those information violations. I think they're incredibly useful. It doesn't mean the person's being deceiving, but as kind of a hot spot and way to bring people back onto track with subsequent questions, I would find IMT just incredibly useful, and way more useful than any so-called cue.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny too, because Tim has told me that, because Tim's had so many experiences with law enforcement over the years and different agencies, governmental and international, and he's actually told me that he's had encounters with people who apparently are using it in some form. I've never heard any of that. I've never been told that, but apparently it is out there within some circles. They recognize the utility of it. So I guess that's a good thing. I'm glad they're using it.
Okay. I believe we have reached the golden triangle of deception research, and I can explain. Yeah, and I'm using this as a segue into truth default. Yeah, so we have Grice, which I would like to spend a moment just to simplify it a bit to make it a bit more better understandable. We have information manipulation theory, which states that the violation of Grice's cooperative principles, the covert violation of the cooperative principles are indicative of deception. And we have the truth default theory, which is closely linked to both of them. Okay, yes. So, and I tried to simplify this. Yeah, so Grice was an English language philosopher, and he came out with the cooperative principle, which this is why it's linked to truth default, because Grice says, we all assume that everybody is following those 4 maxims. That's truth default and truth default theory. Yeah. So for someone, again, I studied acts of omissions in high-stakes business negotiations, and I used your gentleman's work and Grice as a framework because I needed something. I needed to be able to identify what I'm actually looking for, right? And I used Grice is a starting point. The maxim of quality is if somebody speaks the truth or not. Quantity, how much information is actually provided. Now, omissions by definition are a violation of the quantity maxim because people don't provide all the information. Yeah, then is the stuff that they're saying actually relevant to the question? Yeah, you would be surprised how often people answer a question with a different question which has nothing to do with the question. Yeah,
exactly.
And then we have manner, of course. How do you provide the information? Is it clear? Is it ambiguous? Is it vague? This kind of things. Yeah. So for anybody watching this, you have 4 things that you have to watch out if you analyze what somebody is saying or writing to you. These 4 things will give you a clear picture if something's off. Right? And if you overlay this now with information manipulation theory, that means you turn it around. It's the covert, if someone is hiding that those 4 maxims or any or a combination of those maxims are being violated, it's an indicator of deception. And again, now we are coming to truth default, which I would like Tim to present the relation the key points relating to deception detection, right? Because what I said already, Grice already said, we all assume that those 4 maxims are being adhered to, right? Now I give the microphone to you, Tim. So the key items of truth default relating to deception detection.
So the basic principle when I say truth default, people defaulting to the truth. People are basically honest unless they have a reason not to be. That is, deception requires some kind of a motive in the way honesty doesn't. And people tend to passively believe other people unless skepticism or suspicion or doubt is actively triggered. As it relates to deception detection, unless there's some kind of trigger to get you to be suspicious, if somebody's trying to deceive you, they're going to be successful, at least momentarily. Most deception, very often the truth does come out if the truth is important. But it doesn't come out at the time of the initial communication. It's usually discovered after the fact based on completely extra communicative means. There are ways to be better at improving lie detection to break out of 54%. The best way is if you have access to evidence, you can fact check. Fact checking isn't perfect because your decision making will be only as good as your evidence, but fact checking is the best. If you can't fact check, you can assess plausibility, if you think to, by assessing the plausibility of what's said, given what you know about the context. You can consider motive. Does the person have a reason why the truth might be a problem for them, and so why they might not want to be fully transparent with you. We've already talked about, we can persuade them to honesty and try to give them reasons why they should be honest with you or incentivize that or persuade that. And finally, we can use various interrogation strategies. So there's no point in deceiving if you think I already know the truth, so I could try to bluff you that I know the truth. You could combine evidence with questioning strategies, so I could ask you questions where I already know the answer to and see if you tell me the truth. And there's other questioning strategies as well.
Okay, and if you would have to encapsulate, and I close it now one last time, the key, I can't say findings, but the key items, the key takeaways of your book, Duped, what would that be?
Well, I think number one is just the absolute human imperative of having a truth default. Communication just doesn't work without it. If we second guess everything or we lied a lot, and deception characterized most communication. Communication just wouldn't work. There's no point in having all those books behind you, Thomas, if you can't learn anything from them. And if you had to like second guess every sentence you're reading, communication just wouldn't function at all. I think the other main take home of truth to fault theory is, as we've been talking about through this whole thing, the focus on using cues, verbal, nonverbal, or otherwise, to detect deception is just a total boondoggle and misguided.
Okay. Before we kind of conclude, and I see I've definitely overstayed my welcome here for almost half an hour. Yeah. Are there any topics that I have not thought of covering? Are there anything that you would like to highlight in regards to anything that we have discussed? Am I missing? In short, am I missing something?
I just think this has been a great, robust, and interesting conversation. I can't think of anything that I certainly got, to use Tim's phrase, I got my rants in about various things. So
I think we were remarkably aggressive in jumping in to make points as we thought.
Yeah, I
as we became situations
talking over you.
Quite a bit. This is deep trust in your editing ability, Thomas.
Yes. I should. Yeah, please add a beauty filter on me. Looking a little cadaverous this morning.
I spoke to somebody, and he said to me, Thomas, sometimes it's worth not seeing everything so sharp.
definitely a low res face here.
Yes. Gentlemen, I don't know how I can thank you. It was a fascinating discussion. It's the second time I had each of you individually already on interviewed, right? So you gave me twice the pleasure, and now together. I mean, again, for me, for how you and your research complements each other, and I really was serious about the golden triangle of deception detection. Yeah, there are some frameworks which correlate and fit perfectly together. You do not need some, if I can say it's a brutal pseudoscience. Yeah, you don't need it, right? Because you have a framework, a working model that you can apply. You need a little bit of interest, a little bit of discipline, but you don't need to study 20 years to figure something out which is as elusive as a micro movement which lasts for 1/25th of a second. It may or may not be related to an emotion or anything else that we do not know of, right? So there is a working framework if you look at this combination between information manipulation theory, truth default, and the four maxims of Grice. There are only four things you have to know, and you can determine, you can analyze a text, a speech, whatever, on the level of credibility, not deception. Credibility.
There is one way to deceive beyond covert violations of Grice. There's four maxims, which Scott Jacobs pointed out. But we realized before that, I think. And that is, we might call false implicatures, where we say something that's perfectly true, knowing that you will misunderstand. Those I think are incredibly rare. But that's the one way to deceive, other than the four Gricean covert violations.
Lying with the truth.
Yes.
Lying with the truth. Yeah, I actually looked it up. There is a word. It's called paltering. Paltering, yeah. It was new to me too. I had to look it up, but lying with the truth is definitely an element here. Definitely.
I would say one thing in closing, which, and it really relates to what you just said, Thomas, in your very nice kind of summary of how these things fit together, which is folks who are listening to this and are interested, let me just offer an additional, somewhat redundant plug for Tim's book. Because in it he provides a really exceptional characterization of not just his own theoretical work, but other rival positions in the field and IMT. I've read the entirety of his book, but also focused in on the chapter discussing IMT, and it's super legit. So people who are interested in any of the issues that we've talked about today and want a single resource which gets at all of them exhaustively is grab a copy of Duped, because it really does a nice job of all of this.
It's worth it. It's Deception Detection 360, right?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Okay. Good. Perfect. Gentlemen, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Again,
Oh, this was a
was my
blast.
absolute pleasure.
Great to see you again.
You will hear from me again, I promise.
Great. We love it. We love you, Thomas.
This was really
Hopefully
fun.
someday we'll meet in person and we can all have a beer together.
Yes.
That would be
Or
great.
3 or 4.
Yeah.
Good.